not just grunting brutes. We begin in a cold river valley 40,000 years ago. A small band of humans crouches over a fire, furs pulled tightly around their shoulders. One man delicately shapes a flint blade, chipping it with focused precision. Another chews birch bark, carefully heating it over a small flame to extract a sticky resin, an ancient adhesive. A third woman holds a hafted spear, examining the join between wood and stone. This is not chaos. This is not brute instinct. This is focus, planning, thought. For over a century, the caricature of the caveman has been etched into our cultural psyche. Primitive, half-evolved, a lumbering relic from before enlightenment. A cartoon of unthinking survival. But this image was never accurate. It was a product of Victorian-era anthropology, tangled in colonial assumptions and a linear view of human evolution. If we've learned anything from the last 50 years of archaeology, it's this. Prehistoric humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, were not just surviving. They were thinking, engineering, adapting. The first myth we must discard is that early humans were intellectually inferior. The evidence points in the opposite direction. Let's start with the brain. Bigger brains, sharper minds. Neanderthals, far from being less evolved, had larger brains than modern Homo sapiens. Their cranial capacity averaged around 1,500 cubic centimetres, compared to our average of 1,350 cubic centimetres. That's not a typo. Neanderthals had more room upstairs, particularly in regions tied to vision and motor control, which makes sense given the environments they lived in. They weren't sluggish cave dwellers. They were active, mobile, and highly aware of their surroundings. Brain size doesn't automatically equate to intelligence, of course, but it forces us to question our assumption that we've always been the smartest humans in the room. In fact, Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa's Rising Star cave system in 2013, throws an even stranger wrench in the works. Their brains were far smaller, about 465, 610 centimetres cubics, roughly a third the size of ours. Yet the cave contains signs of intentional burial and fire use. A small brain didn't stop them from behaving in profoundly symbolic, even spiritual ways. Scholars still debate whether Homo naledi's behaviours were truly deliberate ritual or accidental deposition. But the implication is clear. Intelligence isn't measured solely by brain volume. It's about complexity, foresight, and adaptability. Engineering in the Paleolithic. One of the most compelling indicators of prehistoric cognition is their tools. Not just crude rocks, but refined, multi-step technologies. The Levallois technique, used by Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, involved preparing a stone core in advance to control the size and shape of the flakes removed. This wasn't guesswork, it was planned manufacturing, creating a Levallois intelligence. We also see early adhesives like birch bark tar, an incredibly complex substance requiring oxygen-restricted heating of tree bark, often without metal containers. The oldest known sample, from Italy, is over 200,000 years old. Think about that. While modern chemistry classes didn't emerge until the 17th century, early humans were solving similar problems with no written instructions. In one case, at Campitello Quarry, researchers discovered birch tar residue on a stone tool, likely hafted with a combination of resin and sinew. It suggests not only chemical knowledge, but an understanding of how to join materials with differing properties. And then there's projectile technology. Spears thrown with atlatls, possibly even early bows. These tools required an understanding of aerodynamics, balance, and force. None of this suggests mental deficiency. It suggests a mind tuned to experimentation and fine motor skill. Spatial memory, environmental mastery. The environments our ancestors moved through were unforgiving. Glacial plains, dense forests, deserts, and mountains. And yet they thrived. Not by chance, but by deeply understanding these ecosystems. A tribe's survival depended on remembering the location of resources, seasonal waterholes, animal migration paths, edible plants, and safe caves. This wasn't rote memory. It was a dynamic spatial intelligence passed down across generations. Mainstream archaeological work at sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, where engraved ochre, shell beads, and advanced bone tools dating to 75,000 years ago were found, demonstrates that early humans weren't simply reacting to nature. They were organizing knowledge, encoding it symbolically, and handing it down. We don't know what their symbols meant, but their mere existence points to a shared cultural memory. Not just one kind of smart. One of the most humbling discoveries in recent decades is that we weren't the only smart species of human. At least 5 different species of hominins overlapped during key points in our prehistory, and several showed signs of intelligence. The Denisovans, known only through genetic evidence and a few fossil fragments, contributed to the DNA of modern Melanesian and East Asian populations. Some of their adaptations, like the EPAS1 gene for high-altitude living in Tibetans, are still with us. The Red Deer cave people, whose remains were found in China, possessed a unique mix of archaic and modern features, suggesting intelligence evolved along different paths. We tend to see evolution as a ladder, but in reality, it was more like a braided river, with intelligence arising in many places, in many forms. Scholars still debate whether interbreeding with these groups was cultural exchange, forced contact, or something in between. But the genetic overlap implies something that changes the conversation. Intelligence was shared, not hoarded. A legacy misunderstood. The myth of the dumb caveman endures because it's convenient. Modern humans on a pedestal. It allows us to believe we're the peak of something, rather than just a continuation of a long, winding path. But the reality is more inspiring. Our ancestors, with no books, no machines, and no electricity, figured out how to thrive. They mapped stars without telescopes. They engineered tools without metals. They cured injuries without medicine. And perhaps most incredibly, they left behind signs that they understood who they were. They buried their dead. They painted their walls. They sang into the darkness. This isn't the story of a brute species clawing its way towards civilization. This is the story of humans, just like us, in all the ways that matter, walking into the unknown, one firelit idea at a time. They spoke, just not like us. In the heart of a windswept steppe tens of thousands of years ago, a group of hunters gathers in a semicircle. The mammoth they've been tracking has veered off course, its massive tracks curving toward a steep ravine. One man kneels in the dirt, tracing the path with a stick. Another whistles softly, one long, two short. A third responds with a guttural rhythm of syllables and hand signs. Within moments, the group has agreed on a new strategy. No one wrote a word. No one needed to. Long before alphabets, long before parchment or ink, early humans were talking, not with broken grunts or crude sounds, but with purpose, structure, and probably even metaphor. The idea that prehistoric humans lacked language is one of the most enduring and frankly insulting misconceptions in our view of ancient life. Today, linguists, archaeologists, and evolutionary biologists are rewriting that story, and the tale they're telling is far more human, the voice box that spoke first. It starts quite literally in the throat. In 1983, researchers unearthed a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton in Israel's Kibara cave. It included a fossilized hyoid bone, a delicate horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck that anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx. What stunned researchers was its striking similarity to that of modern humans. This discovery offered more than anatomy, it hinted at phonetic capability. If Neanderthals had a similar hyoid and the muscular control to use it, then they likely had the ability to form complex vocal sounds. Not just yelps or cries, but true speech, sentences, questions, arguments, perhaps even lullabies. Still, skeptics remained. Could a similar bone mean similar behaviour? The question took a genetic turn with the discovery of the FOXP2 gene, the so-called language gene. In 2007, scientists discovered that Neanderthals possessed the same functional version of FOXP2 as modern humans. Mutations in this gene today can cause severe language impairment. Its presence in Neanderthal DNA suggests they had the neurological foundation for structured speech. That's two pieces of the puzzle, a modern-like throat and the genes to drive it. But what about their brains? Brain endocasts, moulded impressions from skull interiors, show a well-developed Broca's area in both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. This region is associated with language production. Taken together, these anatomical, genetic, and neurological clues form a clear suggestion our cousins weren't silent. Scholars still debate whether Neanderthal language mirrored modern syntax, or if it was something simpler, perhaps tonal or heavily gesture-based. But simpler doesn't mean unintelligent. After all, many modern languages use tonality to convey complex meaning, from Mandarin Chinese to Yoruba. Beyond the voice, gesture, rhythm, and the mouth, but in the hands. Imagine an early Homo sapiens woman pointing toward the horizon, then miming the motion of prey fleeing into the trees. Her companions nod, mimicking her gestures and adding their own. Over time, these gestures become standardized, passed from mother to child, refined with each generation. This is how proto-language may have emerged, as a blend of movement, sound, and mimicry. In 2020, researchers studying chimpanzee and bonobo communication catalogued over 70 distinct gestures shared between the species, many of which carried similar meanings. Given our shared ancestry, it's likely our ancestors used gesture-based systems long before vocal language took center stage. Yet vocalization brought a key advantage, freeing up the hands. Once words replaced gestures, humans could carry tools, tend fires, or hold children, all while communicating in real time. But speech was likely accompanied by song. Many anthropologists believe that early language had a musical quality, melodic, rhythmic, and emotionally expressive. This musa-language hypothesis suggests our ancestors used pitch and tempo to convey meaning long before grammar existed. It's a compelling idea. Music and language engage overlapping brain regions, and we find bone flutes as old as 40,000 years in caves like Hohlefels, Germany. These weren't mere toys. They had tone holes, tuning, and precision craftsmanship. In a world without Spotify or speakers, music was already moving through air and memory. Why language was necessary? Early humans didn't speak for fun. They spoke because they had to. Group living required more than intuition. It needed coordination. Consider the complexities of planning a multi-day hunt, sharing knowledge about edible versus poisonous plants, warning of danger, or explaining the rules of group behavior, teaching children how to knap flint or tan hides, negotiating territory or forming alliances with neighboring groups. Each of these moments demanded a way to transmit abstract information. A grunt might alert someone to danger, but it can't explain why it's dangerous or how to avoid it. For that, you need grammar, you need tense, you need metaphor. Archaeologist Stephen Mithen, in his book The Singing Neanderthals, argues that language likely evolved in step with social bonding. The more complex our groups became, the more complex our communication had to be. Language, then, was not a luxury, it was survival. Memory and myth before writing. We often assume that written history began civilization, but oral tradition is older, deeper, and arguably more powerful. It's what allowed early humans to pass on stories, names, migrations, and warnings over centuries. Among indigenous Australian communities, the concept of songlines, musical maps encoded in oral songs, has preserved geographic and spiritual knowledge across thousands of years. Some of these oral traditions describe landscapes now submerged by spans 10,000 years or more. Prehistoric humans likely used similar methods. Rhymed speech, repetition, and story structure would have made information sticky, easier to pass from grandmother to grandchild. Even before agriculture, they may have had epics, sagas about creation, survival, and identity. And yet, this treasure trove of oral wisdom has vanished, wiped out by time, colonialism, or displacement. Still, the capacity for such memory remains part of us. It lives in lullabies, in folk songs, in bedtime stories passed down without ever being written. The emotional layer. Language isn't just for logistics, it's for connection. What did a Neanderthal mother whisper to her child in the dark of a cave? What jokes did early Homo sapiens share around a fire? What lullabies lulled children to sleep beneath the stars? We'll never know the words, but we know the need. Language allows us to externalize thought. It lets us tell someone, I love you, I'm afraid, or I remember. The existence of burials, adornments, and symbolic objects in the prehistoric record tells us these humans had emotions worth expressing. Language, whether spoken, signed, or sung, was the bridge between inner life and outer reality, unanswered. Scholars still debate whether language evolved once in a single human lineage or multiple times in different groups. Did Neanderthals and Homo sapiens have mutually intelligible communication? Were gestures replaced entirely by vocal speech, or do both still exist in tandem today? What we know is this. Language is not recent. It's not the icing on the cake of civilization. It is the core of being human, and it's far older than we thought. From a genetic mutation millions of years ago to whispered warnings in the savannah, language evolved alongside us. It shaped how we thought, how we taught, how we remembered. So the next time we imagine a caveman grunting nonsense, let's revise that picture. He was speaking. We just don't understand the words anymore. Art, ritual, and memory. A flickering fire dances along the rough stone walls of a deep cave in southern France. In the glow, shapes emerge, painted horses galloping, bison locked in combat, a woolly rhinoceros frozen mid-charge. The images are striking, not crude sketches, but fluid, dynamic, alive. The cave is Chauvet, and its murals are over 36,000 years old. What drove someone to crawl deep into the earth, light a flame, and paint? It wasn't survival, it wasn't shelter. It was something else, something profoundly human. This section explores a truth we've long resisted. Prehistoric humans weren't just surviving, they were creating. Their art, rituals, and memory practices reveal a depth of consciousness, emotion, and even spirituality that we often reserve for modern humans. But the line between prehistory and history is much blurrier than we've assumed. The cave walls speak. When we think of ancient art, our minds jump to places like Lascaux, Altamira, or El Castillo. These caves, scattered across Europe, contain vibrant animal forms, handprints, geometric signs, and enigmatic dots. But similar sites exist on nearly every continent, from Sulawesi in Indonesia, where red-painted babirusas and hand stencils date back over 45,000 years, to Kimberley in Australia, where guion figures dance across sandstone cliffs. These works were not idle doodles. They were deliberate, often located far from living spaces, deep in cave recesses that required torches or oil lamps to access. Many were revisited, retouched, or painted over across generations, suggesting communal memory and shared significance. In Chauvet Cave, for example, artists used the contours of the rock to create illusions of movement, what some have called Paleolithic animation. The interplay of flickering firelight and layered imagery may have produced dynamic visual effects akin to watching moving pictures in a modern theatre. Quirky detail? In some caves, stalactites and wall protrusions were used as musical instruments. Researchers have identified zones with better acoustics, where paintings cluster, hinting that early humans might have combined sound and image in ritual performance. Scholars still debate whether cave art was religious, educational, or mnemonic. Was it shamanic vision, a hunt rehearsal, a symbolic map, perhaps all of the above? What's indisputable is this: the art was not practical. It was expressive. That's intelligence, that's culture. Symbols, beads, and the birth of self. If cave paintings were grand performances of meaning, portable art offered more intimate glimpses into early human minds. Across Africa and the Middle East, archaeologists have unearthed beads made from shells, bones, and ivory, often pierced or polished. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, a site dated to around 75,000 years ago, small pieces of ochre were discovered with engraved cross-hatch patterns. These marks appear to be non-utilitarian, possibly symbolic or representational. This is significant. The capacity to make and recognize symbols is foundational to abstract thought. It suggests a leap from direct experience to representation. From "this is a tool" to "this represents an idea." Wearing beads or painting marks on one's skin or belongings introduces something more: identity. Ornamentation is not strictly functional. It communicates membership, status, emotion. In short, it's a signal of self-awareness. Beads and carvings may also have served as memory aids. Some anthropologists speculate that early humans used patterns, dots, lines, spirals, to encode social or environmental knowledge, much like a mnemonic. Imagine a grandmother running her fingers across a carved bone, each notch recalling a season, a story, a lesson. Fringe theory? Some even suggest that early patterns could represent proto-writing, a way to externalize thought long before alphabets emerged. While still speculative, this idea challenges the notion that writing suddenly appeared in Sumer or Egypt. Perhaps it was a slow evolution, not a sudden revolution. The sacred and the dead. Where there is art and symbol, ritual often follows. In burial sites from Europe to Asia, we find carefully arranged skeletons, often accompanied by tools, flowers, ochre, and animal parts. These aren't haphazard disposals, they are acts of care, intention, and perhaps belief. At Shanidar Cave in modern-day Iraq, Neanderthal remains were found buried alongside pollen from wildflowers, a detail that has sparked decades of debate. Were these flowers ritual offerings, or just carried by rodents into the grave? Scholars still debate whether this was spiritual behavior or accidental contamination. But recent reinvestigations of Shanidar suggest a pattern of Neanderthal burials, one that hints at repeated, structured practices. Even if we can't prove religion, we can prove remembrance. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a triple burial dated to around 27,000 years ago reveals 3 adolescents interred together, one with a deformed spine and facial asymmetry. They were laid in a deliberate arrangement with ochre and decorative objects. The community didn't just bury their dead, they mourned them, they gave them meaning. Burial, in any form, implies an understanding of time beyond the present, a sense of before, during, and after. It suggests that prehistoric humans had emotional depth. Grief, 30,000 years ago, was found adorned with thousands of ivory beads, each likely requiring hours to produce. The beads were sewn into garments that would have been invisible once buried. This wasn't a display for the living, it was a message for the dead, or for something beyond the living. The mind's time machine. Paint, to carve, to bury, it all depends on one incredible cognitive gift: episodic memory. This is the ability to remember past events, imagine future scenarios, and alter behavior accordingly. Modern humans use episodic memory constantly. It's what lets us plan vacations, anticipate danger, or dwell on embarrassment from 10 years ago. For a long time we assumed this capacity was uniquely ours, but tool-making, seasonal migration, and symbolic behavior all imply mental time travel. Consider the planning needed to produce ochre pigment. First gathering the material, then grinding it, then mixing it with fat or water, and finally applying it in meaningful ways. That requires not only knowledge, but memory and projection. I will do this now, so I can make that later. In fact, research with modern hunter-gatherer societies like the Hadza of Tanzania shows that oral storytelling, ritual, and symbolic acts often encode practical survival knowledge: when to travel, where to find food, how to navigate social disputes. Ritual becomes a library of living memory, not superstition. Our ancestors were not trapped in the now, they moved fluidly across time, with mind, emotion, and meaning. Shared space, shared mind. There's one more piece we often overlook: collective imagination. Caves were shared canvases, beads were shared signals, songs were shared memories. The very act of culture requires not just individual intelligence, but a shared framework of understanding. This collective cognition likely helped drive the formation of group identity, a cornerstone of social cohesion. The moment we start saying we instead of I, the world changes. Morality emerges, tradition forms, narrative begins. It's easy to look at a charcoal horse on a wall and see just a horse, but for the person who painted it, and the people who came after, it may have been a god, a story, a warning, or a prayer, and in that moment history begins, not written, but remembered. Stone Age problem solvers. The wind howls across a scorched savanna. A group of humans, lean and alert, surveys a plain littered with bones. In the distance, vultures circle above a carcass freshly felled, not by their own hand, but by predators now long gone. The humans inch forward, scanning for threats. Then they move swiftly, stripping meat, cracking bones, harvesting marrow. But they're not scavengers. They're strategists. They know this land. They've done this before. The notion of prehistoric humans as clumsy, reactive survivors, lurching from hunt to hunt in a fog of instinct, is deeply outdated. Today, archaeologists view these people not as lucky survivors, but as deliberate, adaptive problem solvers, engaged in long-term planning, technological innovation, and group coordination. In fact, many of the strategies they developed remain relevant today, testaments to a kind of intelligence rarely seen in the modern industrial world. Environmental literacy, tactile ingenuity, and communal logic. This was not trial and error in the dark, it was design under pressure. Tools, the prehistoric Swiss Army knife. We tend to think of early tools as just rocks, but look closer. A sharpened stone isn't just a blade, it's a modular system. From the Oldowan choppers of 2.6 million years ago to the Solitrean leaf-shaped points of 20,000 years ago, prehistoric tools show innovation, variation, and elegance. Consider the Levallois technique, a method developed over 300,000 years ago that involved carefully shaping a stone core to remove flakes of predetermined size and shape. This wasn't random bashing. It required foresight, symmetry, and an understanding of fracture mechanics. Mainstream fact. At La Micoque in France, Levallois tools dating back over 350,000 years have been discovered alongside signs of workshop-like activity. Areas where raw stone was transported, prepared, and systematically shaped. That's production, not mere use. And then there's the hafted spear, stone blades mounted onto wooden shafts using adhesives like birch pitch and binding materials like sinew or plant fibre. This is composite toolmaking, a leap forward in engineering complexity. One site in Germany, Schöningen, revealed wooden spears more than 300,000 years old, balanced, aerodynamic, and clearly built for precision hunting. Even more striking is the variety. Some tools were specialized: scrapers for hides, borers for drilling, microliths for arrows. The presence of these miniaturized tools suggests not only technological diversity, but task-specific design. Scholars still debate whether tool innovation. Fire, our oldest technology partner. Imagine a freezing night on the tundra. Without fire, you're dead. Yet making fire isn't easy. It requires technique, striking pyrite against flint, or mastering friction-based methods like fire drills. And once lit, fire must be maintained, transported, and protected. The oldest clear evidence of fire use dates to over 1 million years ago at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. But evidence from Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, around 780,000 years ago, shows something even more impressive. Controlled hearths, arranged spatially, with evidence of repeated use. This suggests not only fire making, but fire management. Fire is more than warmth. It's a chemical reactor. It allowed early humans to cook food, unlocking nutrients, killing parasites, softening tubers. Cooked meat delivered more calories per chew, which some researchers argue helped fuel brain growth. But it wasn't just biological. Fire transformed our relationship to time. Sitting around a fire offered security at night and extended waking hours. This may have created space for storytelling, planning, and cooperation. In essence, fire gave us evening society. Quirky fact: some modern hunter-gatherer groups carry embers wrapped in bark to ignite new fires later. This ancient habit likely stretches deep into prehistory, highlighting fire as mobile technology, not just a fixed site. The landscape as map and pharmacy. Prehistoric humans were not passive wanderers. They read the land like a book, scanning its signs, rhythms and moods. This was environmental intelligence, a kind of thinking deeply attuned to place. They knew migration cycles, fruiting seasons, and animal behaviour. They observed where certain birds nested, which insects emerged after rain, how water pooled in drought. This knowledge wasn't written, but it was recorded in memory, ritual, and group tradition. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dated to around 160,000 years ago, researchers found evidence of early humans harvesting shellfish, timed with tidal cycles and using pigments. This suggests coastal resource management combined with symbolic behaviour. They also knew their plants, willow bark for pain, a natural precursor to aspirin, mint for stomachs, certain mushrooms to induce trance or vision. In Shanidar Cave, the famous Neanderthal burial included pollen from yarrow, chamomile, and other medicinal plants, though scholars still debate whether the flowers were placed intentionally or carried by animals. Nevertheless, the broader pattern is clear. Prehistoric humans had an intimate pharmacy, curated by observation and memory. Even their hunting strategies were advanced. At La Côte de Saint-Brelade, off the coast of Jersey, early humans drove mammoths and woolly rhinos off a cliff edge. This wasn't opportunism. It was planned entrapment, a Stone Age funnel trap, using the terrain itself. Cooperation and social logic. Modern humans pride themselves on cooperation, but the foundations of teamwork were laid long before cities or governments. Prehistoric survival depended on shared tasks, mutual aid and role distribution. In multi-generational groups, the elderly passed on knowledge, the young were trained, and tasks were divided by skill, not just strength. Fossil remains show individuals with disabilities who lived long past the age of injury, indicating care, empathy, and group investment in every member. One stunning example comes from Manok Cave in Israel, where a 55,000-year-old skull showing healed trauma was found in a context rich with cultural material. The person likely survived with help. Even hunting required coordination. Spears had to be timed, prey needed to be funneled. Communication was key. Some researchers believe rhythmic chants, claps, or songs may have helped synchronize movement, a kind of early choreography for life and death situations. And cooperation wasn't just internal. There's growing evidence of intergroup exchange. Obsidian tools found hundreds of kilometers from their source, or seashells inland, suggest trade, or at least network contact. This required trust, negotiation, and diplomacy. Scholars still debate whether these exchanges were based on kin ties, seasonal festivals, or economic reciprocity, but again, the message is clear. Prehistoric people built bridges, not just camps. Innovation through constraint. Innovation isn't always about new resources. Sometimes it's about doing more with less. Early humans faced constant constraint, limited materials, dangerous animals, shifting climates, and yet they adapted, not once, but thousands of times. They made rope from inner bark, containers from folded leaves, fishhooks from bone, weights from clay, nets from grass. In a world without synthetics, they mastered biodegradable engineering. Much of it has vanished, decomposed into soil, but clues remain, in imprints, in residues, in wear patterns. At Abri-Castanet in France, archaeologists uncovered decorated limestone blocks and fragments of woven material pressed into clay. These hint at textile work, a lost art of cordage, weaving and basketry. These innovations weren't inventions in the modern sense. They were traditions passed down and improved upon. A fire-making method here, a fish trap design there. Each a small leap, together forming the long arc of human ingenuity. Intelligence reframed. When we think of problem-solving, we picture spreadsheets, code, or urban design. But prehistoric problem-solving was real-time, high-stakes, embodied. It was the kind of thinking that emerges in uncertainty, creative, responsive, and resourceful. And perhaps that's the deepest myth we've carried, that intelligence must look like us. In truth, it's always looked like them. It looked like a woman choosing the perfect flint from a riverbank, like a boy remembering the stars to navigate home, like a group whispering tactics in the tall grass. They solved problems we'll never face, with minds we've only begun to understand. The myth of the one caveman. Picture the phrase caveman, and a single image likely leaps to mind. A hulking man in animal skins, club in hand, brow heavy, and eyes dull, muttering through thick grunts. It's a trope so entrenched in popular culture that it appears in cartoons, comedy sketches, even advertising. But this image is not just inaccurate, It's misleading on a fundamental level, because there was no one caveman. There was no single prototype of early human intelligence. In fact, during the Stone Age, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human species coexisted. They lived in different climates, developed unique technologies, and exhibited varying but often surprisingly advanced cognitive abilities. This is the final and perhaps most revolutionary myth to dismantle. Prehistoric intelligence wasn't a linear staircase with us at the top. It was a mosaic, a web, a chorus of minds, not a solo voice. A world of many humans. For decades, the dominant narrative of human evolution was tidy and upward, from ape-like ancestors to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus, to Homo sapiens, with a few branches pruned away by time. But this image has been radically reshaped by recent discoveries. Today, we know that during the Pleistocene era, at least 9 different species of Homo may have walked the Earth at overlapping times. These include Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, Denisovans, no formal species designation yet, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, Homo naledi in South Africa, Homo erectus, the long-ranging traveller, early Homo sapiens, possible late Homo heidelbergensis, red deer cave people, a still debated hominin group in China. Each of these hominins had their own physical features, toolkits, and likely their own styles of intelligence. Some lived in cold northern climates, others in tropical islands, some were tall and robust, others stood just over a metre high. Far from a lone genius species, the prehistoric world was a complex ecology of human minds, interacting, competing, interbreeding, and sharing. Neanderthals, more like us than not. Let's start with the most famous alternative human, the Neanderthal. For decades they were portrayed as oafish cousins, strong but slow, clever in some ways but lacking symbolic thought. That caricature has collapsed under the weight of evidence. Neanderthals made sophisticated tools, including hafted spears and bone implements. They used pigments, possibly for body painting or art. They buried their dead, cared for their sick, and hunted in coordinated groups. In some caves, they left behind ornaments, eagle talons, shells, and beads, objects unlikely to be purely utilitarian. Mainstream fact. In Bruniquel Cave in France, Neanderthals built ring structures out of broken stalagmites, deep within the cave, around 176,000 years ago. This suggests planning, architectural symmetry, and perhaps ritual behaviour, all long before Homo sapiens arrived in the region. Genetically, they weren't alien. Most non-African humans today carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a legacy of interbreeding events tens of thousands of years ago. These genes affect everything from immune response to skin tone to altitude adaptation. Scholars still debate whether Neanderthals had fully developed language, or if their speech was more limited. But their behavioural repertoire was clearly wide, complex, and emotionally rich. They weren't failed versions of us. They were a different kind of us. The ghosts in our DNA. If Neanderthals were long suspected, the Denisovans were a surprise. In 2010, scientists sequencing DNA from a pinky bone, found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, discovered a previously unknown species of human. These people left almost no physical remains, but their genetic legacy is scattered across modern populations in Asia and Oceania. Denisovans appear to have passed on the EPAS1 gene, which helps Tibetan populations live at high altitudes. This suggests that the Denisovans had adapted to cold mountainous environments, possibly the Himalayas, and then shared this adaptation through interbreeding. And while we know very little about how they lived, the mere fact that they survived in harsh climates, interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and carried adaptive traits, suggests resilience, intelligence, and ecological mastery. Quirky tidbit. One fossil, known as Deni, was the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. Her genome proves direct interbreeding, a literal blending of minds and histories. Small bodies, big minds. Then there are the so-called hobbits of human evolution. Homo floresiensis, discovered in 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores. These tiny hominins, standing around 3.5 feet tall, had brains smaller than a chimpanzee's, yet made sophisticated tools, hunted cooperatively, and may have used fire. Homo floresiensis challenges everything we thought we knew about the link between brain size and intelligence. Despite their stature, they weren't dumbed-down humans. They were a unique evolutionary experiment, possibly descended from Homo erectus or another lineage that shrank in isolation while preserving critical survival strategies. Even more baffling is the possibility that they lived until as recently as 50,000 years ago, well within the time frame of modern Homo sapiens spread into Southeast Asia. Scholars still debate whether they encountered modern humans, or if their extinction was natural or human-driven. But their intelligence is evident in their stone toolkits and the fact that they survived on a predator-rich island for tens of thousands of years. And they weren't alone in this miniature category. Homo, luzonensis, discovered in the Philippines, also showed a mosaic of archaic and modern traits, again suggesting that intelligence arose in many guises, not just our own. Homo naledi and the burial enigma. Perhaps the most controversial figure in recent paleoanthropology is Homo naledi, a small-brained species discovered in Rising Star Cave in South Africa in 2013. What shocked the world wasn't their appearance, it was their behaviour. The cave system where their bones were found was nearly inaccessible, requiring narrow, twisting passages and vertical drops. Yet hundreds of naledi bones were deposited there, seemingly intentionally. The spatial arrangement, lack of predation marks, and repetition suggest deliberate body disposal, possibly even ritual burial. Why is this controversial? Because Homo naledi had a brain volume of only 465,610 cubic meters, about 1/3 of modern human brains. According to long-held assumptions, such a small brain shouldn't be capable of symbolic or spiritual behavior. Yet the evidence persists. Some researchers argue that the deposits were accidental or the result of natural processes, but others believe we are witnessing a cognitive outlier, a species whose intelligence took a different shape, not lesser, just unfamiliar. This forces us to confront a deeper question. Are we looking for the wrong signs of intelligence? Reframing the family tree. The old model of human evolution, one clean lineage ascending to Homo sapiens, is dead. In its place is a more accurate, messier picture. Multiple human species, each adapting to their own worlds, sometimes coexisting, sometimes colliding, sometimes combining. It's not a line. It's a braid, with strands intertwining and separating across time. And intelligence, our sacred trait, our supposed crown, was not reserved for us alone. It was shared, shaped, transmitted. Some were visual thinkers, others were tool makers. Some remembered stars, others memorized coastlines. Some painted, others buried. And still others, like the Denisovans, left behind only a whisper of DNA and a tantalizing mystery. This is the real story of the cavemen, not singular, but plural, not dim-witted, but diverse. And perhaps that's the greatest act of prehistoric intelligence, surviving difference, to coexist, to adapt, blend. Conclusion. The myth of the dim, brutish caveman has endured for generations, but it never belonged to science. It belonged to our need to feel exceptional. In truth, the humans of the deep past were not shadows or prototypes. They were people, curious, clever, emotional, and wildly diverse. They painted the first murals. They sang the first songs. They mourned the first dead. They solved problems that would humble many of us today. And most importantly, they weren't alone. Prehistoric intelligence wasn't a solitary spark. It was a wildfire of variation, lighting up the world in ways we've only... The next time you think of early humans, let's not imagine a single grunting figure in a cave. Let's imagine a network of minds, each solving, creating, and remembering a world not of one caveman, but of many intelligent humans.